this series of looking at the scriptures for the coming Sunday is today, of course, we this weekend begin a new season in the liturgical life of the church. And it's called the season of Advent. And I thought, just as a little bit of a beginning here, this particular season, as we celebrate it, or as we observe it, as you know, entails 4 Sundays, not necessarily 4 weeks of Advent, but rather 4 Sundays. Now, Advent itself is a later development in the traditional liturgical life of the early church. And Advent, as you know, means a coming, a preparation. And as the result of the Second Vatican Council, which met, as you remember, in the early part of the 1960s, asked that the liturgical year be rearranged a little bit, and it had been already before that, but now it took on that idea. The word Advent, coming, could refer to the first coming of Jesus, could be referring to the coming of Jesus again, what's called parousia, or at the end time, or it could refer to the coming of Jesus each time that we are gathered together in a special way around the table of the Lord, but certainly as we gather together as the family of the Lord. So there's a threefold dimension of that. Now, in the early church, and I give a little bit of a background here because I hope, and maybe over the course of this coming liturgical year, we'll be able to look at some of these aspects, particularly when we look at the seasonal section. The seasonal section is twofold: the Advent Christmas section and the Lent Easter section. But in the early church, you remember that the Christians particularly followed our Hebrew sisters and brother by keeping one day of the week in a special way, to observe the Sabbath. Now, in Judaism, the Sabbath is Saturday. For Christianity, it became Sunday, the day in which, for various different reasons, but the primary reason probably was the occasion of remembering the resurrection of Jesus. So every Sunday, every Sabbath, every Christian Sabbath, remembered the glorious resurrection of the Lord as the community gathered together to pray. Well, over a period of time, they began to say, like our Jewish sisters and brothers, since they have annual celebrations, such as the Passover, wouldn't it be good if we have some annual celebrations? And the first one to be observed in that way was the Easter idea. So Easter, of course, remembers the resurrection of Jesus. Then there were some, and I'm abbreviating a little bit this story, which can get very long, and I don't mean to take up all the time in doing that, was preceded by a period of, I was going to say a week of preparation, which it was first, and then extended to 40 days, the season of Lent. And so this first observance of annual celebrations, the first famous 100 days, began with Lent at a certain point in time, and concluded with the celebration of Pentecost, the gifting of the Spirit. And then that moved on. Days after Pentecost went on and on and on, looking forward to the coming of Jesus in his full glory when he will be revealed to the nations. Now think about that. What would be the feast that would remember Jesus as fully manifested to the nations, if not the Epiphany? And that was really the climax of the early understanding, of Advent. Well, and again, just to kind of throw things quickly into perspective, there grew up in the 4th century, that would be the 300s, an interest in celebrating not simply the glory of Jesus into new life, but his birth into human life. And so the idea of celebrating Christmas emerged on the Christian calendar. And Of course, much discussion about this maybe later on in one of our talks. We'll look at this. No one really knew what date Jesus was born or when to celebrate Christmas, but a decision was made, and that became, remember, we're looking at the development of liturgical life. That became the occasion for observing his birth. Then, well, maybe as we look forward to the celebration of Easter with a Lenten, maybe we should look forward to the celebration of Christmas or the Nativity of Jesus with also some kind of preparation. And therein lies the beginning of the idea of Advent, of coming, where the primary emphasis now was on the historical coming of Jesus, which had already happened, but nevertheless in a very real and important way to remember that birth of Jesus among us as one of us, and how to kind of get ready and prepare for it. Now, it has a very interesting history. Principally, this idea was developed by the Eastern Church. The Western Church, of which we are a part, took a little longer to catch on. But in the 7th and 8th century, the decision to celebrate Advent, and it had a number of ways of looking at it. You can check this out. But at first there were 6 Sundays of Advent, then there were 5 Sundays of Advent, then we thought it would come down to 4 Sundays of Advent. There were fasts that went on during this season. For example, one of the more famous one was known as the St. Martin's Lent, which was St. Martin's Feast was observed on November 11th, and a fast right up until the 25th of December was observed, over 42 or 43 days of fasting. Well, that didn't last real long, and over a period of time, we came down to what we celebrate today for, as I mentioned at the beginning, for Sundays of Advent with their own tradition. Now, I just give a little bit of background that this observance of Advent as the beginning of the liturgical year occurs in the Middle Ages, and that's why even to this day we look at it that way. But why do I mention this? Because when we come to the readings for the first Sunday of Advent in the liturgical calendar, notice what they are. First of all, they come from the prophet Isaiah, 63rd chapter, and it jumps around a little bit, verses 16 to 17, verse 19, then it goes to chapter 64 of Isaiah, verses 2 through 7. So you'll see that it's intended to kind of back up an idea. Well, let's come a minute there. The second reading was from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, is simply a wonderful greeting that begins his letter to that community, found in verses 3 and 4, and you will find that sometimes that greeting is still used when we begin the celebration of Mass. Now, the Gospel comes from the 13th chapter of Mark, and this leads to just again an introduction. Through this coming year, the Gospel, the primary Gospel reading will be from Mark. Now, Mark is generally, as most of you probably know, is now believed to be the first written gospel that we have. For many, many centuries, it was really the short-changed gospel, and many thought that the Gospel of Mark was simply an abbreviation of Matthew, because you see the order, Matthew, Mark, so therefore, and like the Cliff Notes for Matthew. See, those of you who are familiar with that, when you study for tests and that, will recognize that. So that's why Matthew was so short, because it cut down on what many thought was the wordiness of Matthew. Let's get to the point of thing. Today, however, today would be in our lifetime, there's been a re-interest in Mark. In fact, we now see he was no abbreviator of Matthew, but in fact probably set the framework, we've mentioned this in earlier talks, the framework for the gospel traditions of Matthew and Luke. So he is the first of the writers. We will be looking at more and more background about this and how important it became in the early church and why it's important even today. But what is kind of interesting here is for the first Sunday of Advent, chapter 13 in Mark's Gospel is one of the most difficult chapters to talk about. It is known as the apocalyptic chapter. In a certain way, you could take the story of Jesus as it unfolds in chapter 12 and move to chapter 14 with an exclusion of this. Now, what is this all about? Chapter 13 is a long discourse or a long talk addressed to four of the special disciples of Jesus, namely namely Peter, James, John, and his brother Andrew. And it is pictured that Jesus is on the Mount of Olives looking at the city of Jerusalem, and he's now giving a talk to his disciples about what is going to happen. And the gist of this particular chapter has to do with the coming of Jesus in glory. So it's that second advent that I mentioned at the beginning that really is getting the emphasis in this week's gospel. Now, as I say, this discourse pictures Jesus as telling his disciples that how things are going to unfold when the coming of, and the phrase we have seen before is used here in Mark, the Son of Man. Remember that Son of Man, a term that had appeared first in the work of Daniel, the book of Daniel, in which in the course of that book he talks about one as a son of man coming, and we pointed out that probably in Daniel the Son of Man had the S with small letter, but what happens in the gospel tradition, and Mark is the first to do this, capitalizes the S and capitalizes the man. Son of Man now is a reference to Jesus. And in fact, in the gospel traditions, Jesus himself calls himself the Son of Man. In fact, in this gospel, that term appears 14 times. So you can see that Mark has used it or seen it as an important way to talk about the uniqueness of Jesus, and later tradition will see it as reflecting the divineness of Jesus. So there is the beginning of this. Now, what I kind of fumbled a moment about, when you look at verses 33 to 37, you might wonder, well, wasn't there verse 1 to 32? And aren't we skipping something? And yes, we are. Part of it is because there is a repetition of it that we heard last time in Matthew's gospel. Now, remember that Matthew used as his guide the work of Mark, and often Matthew would flesh out rather than abbreviate some of the ideas that Mark had. Well, what goes on in verses 5 through 37 that we're not going to hear from the pulpit, but which is important to kind of lead up to see what this whole chapter is about. As I say, it's unique. It is somewhat difficult to interpret. It has many interpreters. It's written in, as we've mentioned earlier on in other talks, in the apocalyptic language, a very colorful language, which was very popularly used, well, from about 200 years before the common time and about 200 years after the common time. So in the world of Jesus and the New Testament writers, apocalyptic writing was very popular. And we have a number, of course, of apocalyptic works that have survived. They are not in the New Testament or in the Old Testament, but they are what we call intertestamental works. And you can look them up and see that they liked to use this colorful and remembered language, which the danger becomes in taking this language and interpreting it literally. And there has been a tradition of doing that, but in the sense of how it is used or was used in the first century world, it had much more the literary aspect than rather the literal way. And it talks about the fact that there will be grand events, often these we would perceive as disasters, which would precede the glorious coming of Jesus and his kingdom. And in the course, you can look these verses over in Mark if you have the opportunity. We'll see that, first of all, Jesus says, don't be deceived. There will be those who say, it's coming, the end is here. Don't pay attention to them, because nobody really knows. It's an interesting thought here. Nobody really knows when this, now, how should we look at this? The end of something in order that there might be the beginning of something new. So sometimes this is talked, these phrases are used, the end of the world. Well, yes, that in order to have a new beginning, I guess you have to have the end of something. You got kind of the logic of that. And the end of the world is told in apocalyptic terms, often using nature as a way to get your attention and exaggerate. Earthquakes, famines, terrible storms, all kinds of things will happen in nature. Is God destined or determined to destroy the world? Nature, that is. And sometimes a literal interpretation, you remember, has left that kind of impression. Let me make that point, that what is going to be the end of things is an order of human operation, of politics, of how people are being treated. An old way will come to an end when the new kingdom of Jesus and of God will come into being. So in that sense, the end is not the destruction of planet Earth. After all, God had created the earth. Go back to the opening words of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and when he had been finished creating things, he looked at it and said, it's good. Why would God destroy nature? Nature didn't become bad. Nature didn't turn against God. Who turned against God? Well, got it. And so those who had created that kind of situation might find themselves on the way out. So, but to get your attention, and remember that's one of the things I think that apocalyptic writing does, to get your attention, we talk about it in big terms. So terrible earthquakes, see? Terrible things that are going to happen on the earth. And then there will be, of course, and he points out, wars. Nation will rise against nation. Well, that unfortunately has been a history of the human family for almost from the very beginning, hasn't it? How terrible it is that we have turned against one another, beginning even with the first story after Eve and Adam have sons. Cain kills Abel. That from the very beginning, somehow, violence has been a part of the human story. Not something that nature does, but now we may say violent storms, but that's our perspective of them, okay? But in itself, the real violences that do away with humans or hurt humans is something which humans, unfortunately, create. So that's the first part of the chapter 13. Then in verses 24 through 27 is the kind of more positive image of what this coming of the Lord will be. And there's a parable there called the parable of the budding fig tree. This is in verses 28, 29. Now, those of you who are familiar with life in Palestine or the Middle East will know that the fig tree is one of the few trees, maybe one of the only trees, that sheds its leaves in autumn. Now, we who live in Western New York say, oh, we spend a lot of time raking up leaves, all right. Wouldn't it be nice if that didn't happen? But so the fig tree, unlike many of the other trees that grow in that area, did have two seasons. It had the winter season and then we would call it the summer season. So there was a time in which the fig tree would blossom with new leaves, with new blossoming. And that's part of the parable. These are little parables. Mark, as we will see, is not famous for extensive parables, but here is one little one. And when you see this happening, when you see, like when we look to see that summer is coming or the new season is coming, then you will maybe notice, if you look around, if you're attentive, that the coming, grand coming, the great coming of Jesus is at hand. I pause here because you remember that this idea of the coming of Jesus in glory seems to have been very prevalent in the first century of the Christian experience, that many Christians truly expected the glorious end, well, if there's a glorious end, but the end of things and the glorious beginning of a new time and a new world. So they were still hoping for that. And Mark, being one of the first writers of the gospel tradition, also incorporates that into his message. So that when you see this new budding come, be ready for the coming of the Lord. Now, and so the coming of the Lord in this regard is one of great promise and of new life, just as nature in the fig tree's branches brings new life, so does the coming of the Lord going to bring new life. Now, part of this message, as Mark is presenting it, is for those who are becoming discouraged at the fact that the coming of Jesus was delayed. And some were beginning to think that maybe it wasn't even going to happen. So part of the message of chapter 13 is to remind his audience, the persons to whom he is directing this gospel, that the coming has not come yet, but it definitely is coming. And that the other side to this is there is the present danger that some may even say that it has already come. And the author here wants to say, no, it's not come. So it is still coming, it hasn't come, so what do you do in the meantime? Be ready, do the kinds of things. And the emphasis again is, in order to look to the future, we need to do well in the present. If you think about it, how you create the present often very much affects the future. So in this gospel, there's no judgment of Jesus in this regard, but rather is the promise of new things and good things when they come. Now, the actual section that we're going to look at this week in verses 33 to 37 have that in mind. Be ready, because no one knows when the Son of God is coming. See what I mean? We've already mentioned it has not yet come, but it will come. And it hasn't come, so be ready for the coming. So it's really simply a little message of reassurance and watchfulness. And as we now liturgically begin the celebration of preparing for the historical birth of Jesus, we continue from last time the idea that the coming of Jesus in glory will still be happening. Now, I don't think we wake up every morning and say, oh, I hope it happens today, but we do keep it alive, do we not, in our prayer? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. So we do keep that spirit alive. So watchfulness. And there's a little bit of concern in verse 36 about falling asleep. Do we fall asleep well, and you can see a homily there, but probably the allusion here, as he's talking to these 4 disciples, right soon he's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he will find the disciples who have fallen asleep. So there's a little bit of a preview here, a little kind of admonition, if you want, to the disciples at this point. The last verse talks about a gatekeeper. Because a man goes away and he's going to return, and it's the job of the gatekeeper to make sure that when he sees the master returning, he gets everybody else awake and ready. And he's got to be awake at the right time. Now, he watches at night. Now, according to the Roman way of doing things, and New Testament seems to follow that. In fact, the Mediterranean world seems to follow that there were what they call 4 watches of the night. So it was evenly broken up into 3. So from 6 p.m. to 9, from 9 to midnight, from midnight to 3, from 3 to 6 in the morning. So and they even called, the first one was late, the second one was midnight, the third one was cockcrow. And in fact, that term cockcrow will also appear, you will find, in the Passion narrative with regard to Peter. And then early. So early, some of you are like this, early is from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So that's the 4th of the time. So it's important here that the doorkeeper be watching no matter when that might happen, okay? So that therefore he can wake up the rest of the people in the house so that they can kind of brush their teeth and be ready to greet the master when he returns. You know how important it will be to have the family there to greet him as he returns from his journey. I suppose we see some images of that in television programs that you have, where when the important man is going to come. Jane Austen's novels often kind of portrayed that they would all line up and be there when he got out of his coach or got off his horse to greet him. Well, it's that sense of greeting, though, that certainly is suggested to us, that as we begin this new liturgical year, we might be ready to greet the opportunities, the advantages, the kind of situations that will come our way to help us work in preparing for the kingdom of God, to be ever watchful for the return of beloved family members. So there are a number of, you can see kind of different homily ideas that will flow from this chapter. Now, I point out that this chapter, called the Apocalyptic chapter, is the first New Testament presence of apocalyptic writing. It's not the whole of Mark's gospel. In fact, this is the only section of it, but it filters into the other 2 gospel synoptics, Matthew and Luke, and certainly, as we have mentioned before, in the final book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, very much is an example of apocalyptic thinking and of apocalyptic writing. So I've kind of wandered around and back to that idea because it is important to be careful of taking too literal a reading of this particular kind of writing. We don't find a lot of it in the Gospels. We find it here, and as I said, in the other 2. But outside of that, It's the only time that we find that. Well, as we get ready for the coming of Jesus, so you can see those three ideas that were suggested, the first coming of Jesus, which is what we will be looking for and toward in the next couple of weeks. Now, by the way, although this is the first time that we have Mark, we're not going to hear Mark every week. Mark is much too short, so it's going to be filled in with other sections and other parts of the gospel tradition. In fact, next week we'll see right away we're going to somebody else. But for now, get your first gospel out. Maybe you want to start reading Mark, see how beautifully he puts together the story of Jesus. Until he comes in glory, that's the end for today.